Welcome to the Psychology World podcast. I'm Connor Whiteley, bringing you psychology news, articles, and other interesting psychology-related articles. You can find the podcast notes and more interesting psychology-related things, and you can get your free 8 psychology book box set at connorwhiteley.net. Now let's get on to the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 153 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. And today's episode is on, is it okay for clients to ask psychotherapists questions? And it is Wednesday, the 1st of June 2022 as I record this. So today's episode I think is absolutely brilliant because as a future or current psychotherapist, so our clients will always ask us some sort of questions, like whether it's about our personal lives, our professional life, or just something that helps them to feel more comfortable. But one of the biggest questions is should we answer these questions, or should we just prefer not to comment and just to crack on with the therapy itself? So that's the focus of today's episode. So moving on to the psychology news section, we've been from the British Psychological Society Research Digest, and I'm really glad that the BPS actually sent this out early, this week, because I'm recording the podcast early because it's the Jubilee weekend in the UK, and I've got tons of family things planned so that we're for the weekend, so I might not have time to do the podcast. So the first one is, American politicians are becoming increasingly rude and disrespectful on Twitter. If you've been on social media at all in the last decade, you may have noticed it's becoming an increasingly toxic environment. Antisocial language is on the rise, but not only among the general public. An analysis of hundreds of thousands of tweets from US members of the Congress has found that their language in their posts has become increasingly more and more rude and disrespectful since 2009, and this seems to be because uncivil tweets are rewarded with more retweets than likes, a finding that highlights the perverse incentives driving the way we communicate with each other on social media. So without going into politics, there's not a great amount I can actually say on this, but to be honest, this is what I don't follow politicians on Twitter, or basically they're any social media, because I don't want to be around all of their negativity, because of course most of them do just attack each other, which is just not, to be honest, I just don't think it's how it should be done. I think that politics should be a bit more the aspect, and that's how social media should also be, because some of the language as you use on social media is just appalling, and there's absolutely no need for it. So the second one is, robot touch makes people feel good, especially when accompanied by robot small talk. Okay, this sounds interesting. For many of us, the past 2 years have demonstrated how important the touch of others is to our emotional well-being, and how hard it is to go without it. But in the absence of physical contact from other humans, could robots provide an adequate substitute? Past work has found that robot touch can elicit positive emotions in people, and now a new study in a scientific report finds the effect is better when the robot talks at the same time. Oh wow, now this I think is just fascinating. And I should also note that I've been looking into the whole behaviour side of robotics and how they can actually help us in psychological interventions, and while some of the research is just abysmal, it's just so poorly done and everything, and also whilst some of the robot research has actually massive limitations, it's still such an interesting field though, because it could actually help us and be a lot more beneficial. So this just adds to the positivity surrounding it. But robot small talk, I don't know. I mean, what would you talk to robot about? Obviously, there'd be tons of pre-programs conversations within the robots, but I think it'd be quite interesting just to have an actual conversation. Yeah, but that's probably just the sci-fi writer in me talking. So the final one is, stigmatization of yawning could be a strategy to avoid disease, study argues. It's really common to start yawning after seeing someone else do it. You might even be yawning right now, just reading about it, or in this case, hearing about it. But we also instinctively know whether there's something a bit rude about yawning. We're less likely to show this yawn contagion when we're being watched, for instance, and even when we do yawn in the presence of others, we often cover our mouth. Why does this yawning carry this stigma? The obvious explanation is that yawning indicates that we're tired or bored, and we might not want to make others feel that they are the source of that boredom, even if they are. But the authors of a new study in personality and individual differences has another intriguing theory. We dislike yawning because it can be a sign of disease. Okay, that's really interesting because I doubt I'm alone in this, but I wouldn't make that first connection. Yes, and I'm not going to read into the paper because we haven't got time. A time of the podcast. But I guess that the first symptom really is that if you're tired, you would tend to be drained, a lot more tired that way because your body is fighting off of the disease. So yeah, so I actually do see the connection. Interesting. Yeah, that really is. So I really hope that you enjoy the psychology news section. So let's move on to the very short personal update. So we're moving on to the personal update. So because I'm recording this on Wednesday, I'm basically going to skip the personal update because I've not been up to too much psychology related, and there's not been a lot of other stuff that are going on because it's only into the week. Plus I've been doing tons of fiction and other stuff. So as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment in the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast. And you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi whiteley. I always love to hear from all of you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And today's episode has been sponsored by Psychology of Relationships, the social psychology of friendships, romantic relationships, and more, third edition. So the reason why this is a sponsor for today's episode is because when our clients ask us our questions, they're trying to build and they're trying to develop the therapeutic relationship, and they're trying to drive self-disclosure. And as this book says, self-disclosure can actually increase liking behavior. So that's how it ties into today's episode. But it's really easy to understand. Brilliant book, covers a wide range of stuff. For example, the biological, cognitive, and social reasons why friendships and romantic relationships form, and then it also goes on to the psychology of communication, which I'm sure that all of us could improve in. And then it also goes into pro-social behavior like bystanderism, why do relationships change and end, and so much more. So I really do love this absolute brilliant book. So that is the psychology of relationships, the social psychology of friendships, romantic relationships, and more, a third edition, available from all major ebook retailers, and you can order the paperback and the hardback version from Amazon, your local bookstore or local library if you request it. But if you didn't want to buy a book, but you still wanted to give the podcast a bit of one-time support, then you can now buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. So let's go on with the content part of today's episode. So we're moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be talking about, is it okay for clients to ask psychotherapists questions? And as I've said earlier, that I really do like this topic because as a current or future psychotherapist, it is rather hard for us to fully understand the sorts of concerns and questions that our clients are having in regards to us. And of course, there will be questions that are completely off the limits to them, for example, because they're inappropriate or because they're too personal, though. It does beg the question, what if our clients ask us a personal question? Is it professional to answer? So that's why I'm going to be looking at this great topic today. So as I've mentioned before, I like different podcast episodes and in different books. The therapeutic relationship between us and our clients is very naturally balanced. It's because we are the experts and the professionals, and apparently they're the messed up ones. Of course, though, modern clinical psychology does not believe that in the slightest, because we don't see them as messed up, and instead we see them as the people with maladaptive coping mechanisms. But that doesn't stop wider society from believing this really outdated and damaging view. Anyway, throughout therapy, a client shares with us their fears, concerns, and joys, and basically how their mind works. However, as all of this is done without us sharing or doing the same, so it's natural for our clients to wonder about our background, opinion, approach, or simply how we're doing that, which I think is actually really nice of them. This is even more important when we consider how we're social creatures that are built on relationships with other people, as social psychology teaches us. And of course, that this whole relationship idea is rather harder when our clients don't know how personal their questions can get, since, as I spoke about in another podcast episode, and the psychology of relationships, self-disclosure drives liking behavior. Therefore, the answer to is it okay for clients to ask psychotherapists questions is very simple. The answer is simply yes. Of course, if the question is outrageous or inappropriate, then that's a completely different matter. But as long as the questions are valid and likely relevant to the therapeutic process, then there's a little reason not to, unless you simply don't want to. Since in the therapeutic relationship, we don't have to answer every question asked of us, but we can help explore the significance of it. Personally, I like the idea of this exploring, because it's just fascinating, because the question had to be important to the person for some reason. And now I sort of understand where the misconception about psychologists and analysing everything someone said comes from. In addition, I should also note that this self-disclosure does depend on your therapeutic model too, since if you specialise in one of the older forms of therapy, like psychodynamic or psychoanalysis, then these approaches encourage the blank slate idea, where the client projects their thoughts and feelings to the therapist without any sort of interference. However, newer forms of psychotherapy encourage a more dynamic relationship between the client and the therapist, where the therapist is encouraged to some extent to get those in self-disclosure. Overall, the answer is that it is okay for clients to ask psychotherapists questions. Questions is mainly down to your own personality, beliefs, and therapeutic model. And remember, if you don't want to answer a question, you seriously don't have to. A common question therapists have asked. So to add a bit of depth to this episode, I want to quickly look at, and in the blog post, I like to say quickly, but then it goes on for another 500 words. So quickly is a bit relative. So back to the blog post. I want to quickly a common question now that therapists have asked by their clients, and why these questions aren't so critical. Firstly, a lot of our clients ask different forms of, will you be able to understand me? And this might sound like a strange question at first, because of course most psychotherapists will be able to. They've all had extensive levels of education, had plenty of other work experience, and have had plenty of other clients over the years. However, not everyone knows this, and as humans, we like to believe that we're very, very special and unique. And to be honest, we actually are, since we all have our different backgrounds, influences, and other factors that can impact our mental health difficulties and conditions. As a result, a client who is a single father of 2 young boys might ask the therapist if they have kids, or a client who is struggling with depression or an eating disorder. They might ask if the therapist has had any experience with the condition before. Additionally, these questions can cover a wide range of the topics of their concern to the client as well. For example, clients might ask about politics, sexuality, gender, families, race, and relationships, and more. Now, the list above is very extensive, but to different people, different things are very important. And I want to jump to a point about the lack of diversity within clinical psychology, since there is a lack of male, non-white, non-middle class, and non-heterosexual therapists available. Personally, I think it's really important to widen the diversity within clinical psychology, just so regardless of whoever needs help can find someone with similar experiences to themselves. Due to, as a man, I might feel more comfortable talking about my difficulties with a man rather than a woman. Then a black person might feel more comfortable talking to a black person. All of these are valid questions for the client, and it helps them to understand how the therapy will work. In terms of us as the answerers of the questions, there are a lot of different ways to respond to this question. A lot of therapists answer this directly, and they will share personal details. For example, if they have kids, if they're gay, or another member of the family is, if they've encountered the condition before, and more. Other people will not answer this directly, but will explore the reason for the question in the first place. For example, they might ask, why do you ask? Or are you worried that I won't understand your struggles? Talk to me about it. Conclusion. So at the end of this episode, I want to emphasize that good therapists will be rather careful with self-disclosure, because as I mentioned in my red flags post a few weeks ago, self-disclosure is a tool, and that you might want to only share what is relevant to the client. If you use the self-disclosure too little, then that you might lose the chance to connect with the client and deepen the therapeutic relationship. Use too much, self-disclosure screams into the red flags, as I discussed in that episode. So to wrap up this episode, I think the takeaway is rather clear. Answering a question so that the client asks you can be a great way to connect and make the client more comfortable with the therapy, and it can really help with their nerves, right? As well as a few therapists have said in posts I've read and in lectures, it is in the job of our clients to figure out what's appropriate with our therapy. It's our job as a future or a current therapist to help them find the boundaries, and answering questions can be a great way to do that. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and that you got some out of it. I really like looking at these like psychotherapy sort of like topics because I think they're really helpful and they're really quite informative for me personally. So I hope that you liked them too. If you know anyone who would enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help us spread the word about the podcast. And definitely check out Psychology of Relationships, the social psychology of friendships, romantic relationships, and more, third edition, available in all of the usual places. Definitely check out buymeacoffee.com/Con Wiley if you want to support the podcast that way. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see the show notes, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. And if you want a free 8-book psychology box set, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.